I do have to say, it's been a pleasure to follow Summer's work. We went to the same grad school together and apparently graduated the same year. I didn't, for some reason I didn't know that. And we didn't know each other at the time, but I've always been a really big fan of her work, and it's been such a joy to see it grow and to have the opportunity to kind of have that history together and to bring it here to the Kemper Museum, I think is really important. We received the 2016 New York Nada Arcadia Award and the 2019 Northern Trust Prize at Expo Chicago. The artist's work is in the permanent collections of the Dallas Museum of Art in Texas, the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, the Perez Art Museum in Miami, the Henry Art Gallery at the University of Washington in Seattle, the Mint Museum in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the Speed Art Museum in Louisville, Kentucky, just to name a few. And if you're driving around downtown, all of those really fantastic electronic billboards that change, you'll notice that they have 4 of Summer's amazing works on them as well. So we're gonna see her work all over town. They're really gorgeous. They'll probably stop you in the tracks. I recommend pulling over into a parking lot like I did and taking a photo because it's a little bit easier. Tonight she's going to walk us through some really important touchstones throughout her career. Please enjoy the exhibition and come back again and often. We've got a lot of really good programs in conjunction with the show as well. So I want to welcome Summer to Kansas City and, and the Kemper Museum.
So I just have a few words to start. Thank you so much for being here today. This project was initiated by Erin Jajets and the Kemper Museum. And as Erin said, I've known her since 2000, I guess we became friends in 2009. And so I'm happy we finally had this opportunity to work together. So I want to say that I realize this isn't the Academy Awards, but I don't do this work alone, so I have a few people to thank, and I hope you'll bear with me here. So to start, I would like to thank the museum for all of the support in creating this exhibition and catalog. Personally, I would like to thank Mary Kemper-Wolf, as well as Bill and Christy Gautreau, the board members, affiliates, and supporting community for providing access to contemporary art and progressive dialogue. For me, this is like a really important museum because I grew up in Oklahoma City, so in my younger 20s I would come up here and this is where I came to see contemporary art. This project would not have been possible without the curatorial guidance of Erin Jajets. She helped me solidify the ideas for the show and shape its execution. She's been compassionate, helpful, and a true professional, so thank you, Erin. And then I wanted to thank my incredibly supportive team, who some of which is here today. I want to say specifically to Abby Walworth that you are a true individual, a brilliant source of positive energy that brought much depth, understanding, and compassion to my practice. Thank you. And to Lucia, you are a grounding force behind me and keep the motor of the studio running. I'm eternally grateful for your passion, dedication, and drive. You are a real badass. Thank you to the Shulamit Nazarian team for all of their hard work on this exhibition. Shula, the founder and owner of the gallery, isn't able to be here today, but she is someone of deep and true kindness, and so I want to acknowledge her for that. And Seth and Melanie are here, and I wanted to say thank you to Seth for your friendship and incredible focus, and Melanie for your fire and passionate drive. And the entire team, it's just an honor for me to partner with you because you really understand my process and treat me with such kindness and care. Andrew Edlin is also here tonight, and I wanted to thank him for his support and for loaning one of his works to this exhibition. And I'm so grateful to the many friends and colleagues who came here from different parts of my life. I feel like I'm having a wedding. Your encouragement and wisdom means the world to me, so thank you for being here. And lastly, I would like to thank my husband, Joe, and as always, I want everybody to know that he's the best man in the world. So I start with this image because it's kind of like the beginning of when I became interested in art. I was 6 years old, and I was kind of a shy and quiet, and I would think very kind kid. And there was an animator that came to visit our school, and he had just like a white piece of paper and a pencil, and he started drawing these bunny rabbits and animated them onto the page. And he was using like hardly any materials, but he was creating and conveying this animated world on the white page. And I specifically remember like elbowing other kids out of my way so that I could get as close to him as possible. And I was just focused on trying to understand how those pencil marks were coming together to create these shapes and rhythms and movements. And from then on, I was pretty hooked and fascinated on how you could bring a world into a two-dimensional plane. As I mentioned, I grew up in Oklahoma, so I didn't have a lot of access to Western art history, but I did have Lisa Frank, who I feel like played a pretty significant role in my understanding of color and form and shape. And I just like vividly remember trying to draw the paws of these animals, like for instance, and I didn't have the language for like knowing what a concave or a convex line was, but I remember trying to like understand how concave and convex lines came together to create forms and shapes. And I would concentrate for hours trying to replicate what I saw in my school folders. The other really important part of my learning, I guess, was just by the nature of growing up in Oklahoma, I didn't really have a lot of access to Western art history. Most of what I was given in school were Native American books and magazines, and this was before the internet, and so we would just have these stacks of Navajo blanket images to look at, or Native American magazines, and so these were the sort of images that I learned to draw from. And I would often use like my Prismacolor pencils and try to replicate what I saw in a Navajo blanket. And I just put this into the lecture because I think it's so funny. The other thing that I kind of thought of as a kid as an artist, I didn't really understand, you know, what a fine artist was. I thought of artists as like a musician or a dancer or someone like Madonna or Michael Jackson. And it's very unfortunate that I can't sing and dance because that's what I really wanted to be. And if I were, I would be up here with smoke machines and lots of dancers and the whole 9 yards. I would really go all out for something like that. But I have no ability to sing or dance, and that was quite sad. But there was a counselor at my school, and this is kind of weird. He had this huge reference book with celebrity names and addresses, and if you told your teacher that you had a problem, you could go to the counselor's office, and once you told him a problem, he would give you the address to Madonna or Michael Jackson. So it was sort of the beginning of many misunderstandings when I would go to my teacher and I would tell her or him I had a problem, and they would send me to the counselor's office. And what I was really after was Olivia Newton-John's fan club address. This was another thing that I kind of looked at as a kid, and even though I didn't really know why, I had this notion that things weren't exactly the way that they were, you know, being told to me. The stories that I was looking at in paintings weren't, I felt like, the truth. So, like, this is an example of one of the paintings at the Oklahoma State Capitol, and I just remember even maybe at 10 or 11 thinking, how absurd. And sorry for the poor image quality, but I'm pointing out, like, in the corner here, you see this white man, businessman, and an Indian, like, having a very happy conversation. And when I was a kid, I kind of knew that that wasn't necessarily true. So I think that it was, in a way, like, inspiring to want to go, behind things or look at the other side of how stories are being told. This is another image that would give you an example of what I was looking at as a teenager or a kid. And I think it's interesting because the surface qualities and the textures that are seen in these paintings are incredibly tactile and real, and they're conveying things like the individual beads of his attire, or the leather and the drum, or the feathers, like each little piece of detail comes together to create this surface textural world, and I was always trying to relate to those textures and convey them with some kind of realism. And as I grew older and went to school and learned more about Western art history, I really got into Vermeer, and in the same way I thought it was interesting to sort of compare the two, and how Vermeer was actually after the same kinds of things, where he was trying to make these wooden objects look like glossy wood, or feathers feel like feathers inside a two-dimensional plane. I'd say probably one of the most pivotal moments for me was embarking upon a Giesbin exhibition at the High Museum in 2005. And it was soon after I was towards the end of my graduate career, and I was going to see this quilt exhibition with a friend of mine, and I didn't really even know why I was going, because this person invited me, so I just went along. And I ended up staying in that exhibition for, not even exaggerating, probably 8 hours. I was just enthralled with these quilts. I loved them so much. And there are many reasons for that. One being that these quilts were they're from this town called Giesbin in Alabama, and they're made from this community of women who create these quilts together. And the geometric patterns and the shapes within them are really off the map in terms of where they're coming from. They're very much invented worlds of abstraction. The other thing that I was drawn to about them is just that they were never really meant to be seen as pieces of art. They were blankets that were used. And so when you are in front of them, you can see the life energy within them, within the fabrics. You can see the cigarette burns and the denim jeans that were used to make them. And you can just feel the realities within them, that they were actually used and never thought of as pieces of art. So I loved this idea that something that was from daily life, that was used every single day in this very sacred place, was then brought to this museum and displayed as a work of art. And each one had its own story and world around it. And I just still to this day love these works. On the other side of the museum from this show were a lot of the permanent collection works that the High Museum has. And it was kind of interesting that day because there were all of these Jonathan Laskers out, and Peter Halley and Mark Rothko, and I just thought it was so interesting to look at these two worlds kind of back to back, or with this wall between them, because they're both obviously very much invested in the ideas of geometric abstraction, but they're coming from completely different places. So they weren't necessarily meant to be in communication with each other, but I felt at that time that I needed to somehow bring a type of communication between those two worlds, in which I wanted to offer some kind of felt, intuitive expression in my work, but also have this rigor behind it, also have this academic side, and also have this investment into trying to understand what it is to abstract a thought. These are a couple of comparisons that I think are interesting, like one of the Giesbin quilts with the Mark Rothko painting. I mean, you wouldn't think in looking at my work that I would be so interested in geometric abstraction, but it's kind of my favorite thing. This is a Peter Halley with another Giesbin. And I mean, they're both kind of pointing towards these worlds of isolation, and they break down these spaces, these psychological spaces, in a way that I think is very different, but could be compared and thought of as the same kind of way of going about creating images. So it was at that moment that I decided that I needed to find a way to turn paint into string. And this was just one of my challenges that I put on myself that was sheer torture for many years, trying to make this liquid medium into something solid and stringy. So I started studying a lot of lace patterns, like 17th century lace patterns, and I was thinking of them as like line drawings. So I would sit in my studio and try to memorize the patterns inside the drawings and then replicate them into paint. This was one of the early, I guess, achievements of doing this. After a few years, I had finally figured out how to mold the paint into these line articulations, and I think this was in 2008 or 9. The other reason for, I guess, my need to do this was just that I had always made these drawings on cash register tape, and they were kind of, for me, an interesting format to work on, for one, because they were just this ongoing, surface that I could work on that felt like it could never end. So I had this eternal page to work on. And then also I just liked the idea of using cash register tape in the way of it being, something you could hold in your hand, and something that we use as a place in which we record our value, and also just as an ancient scroll, something that you would tell a story on. So I had always wanted to make my paintings with these lines, and I thought that my voice was in these drawings, but I just didn't want to paint lines on canvas. So I was really interested in trying to find a way to make my lines dimensional. This was all back in 2009. These were some of the people I was looking at. I really was into George Condo and how he used cartoon images but somehow made them sophisticated. Somehow he was able to pull these elements together, something very disturbing and funny, and for me that was one of my biggest challenges, because my paintings were either far too disturbing or far too funny, and it just was really hard to make the two of them come together in a way that I thought was where I wanted to point to. And then Carol Dunham was a major person for me. I just was really into his use of material and shapes and the visceral quality of his work and the sort of disturbing nature of it. Also using these kind of cartoons to explain some of his darker psychological spaces. Another person was Sue Williams, especially her early work. I was really interested in her grotesque images and the kind of wrongness of all of her drawings. Then also just she made a lot of comic book images and things that were just very grotesque. So she was also another person that was in this equation of resource material that I was drawing from. And then materially speaking, I was really interested in trying to find a way through making paintings to mix de Kooning and Seurat together in one place. And that was another just impossible challenge I set up for myself that took many years to sort out. Mainly because I just really like working with paint in a physical manner. I like pushing it around and mixing big vats of it, and working with my hands and almost like a clay material. And then I also have this other side of my personality that's very obsessive and needs everything to come to a finite point. So the range I was working with was just kind of insane. But there is an achievement in the process that I'm working in now that kind of gratifies both of those sides. So you can see like on one side here, like the de Kooning, like a section of a de Kooning work, and then on the other side, the back side of one of my paintings. So from the back, I'm pushing the paint through this mesh, and it's very messy, and it looks very much like a de Kooning painting from the other side. And then from the front, you can see all of these little points, so it kind of captures this idea of pointillism. So fast forward to 2014, I sort of like threw everything out of my studio and started over from scratch, and really just started to build this resource library of things from artisans or people of unknown origins. And I started looking at spoons and shoes and thinking about things like this as like sort of in the same way as like an object that you would see like in the G-spin quilt, like something that had been used or had a life form behind it, but then was presented as an artifact. And I just started thinking about how I wanted my work to imbue this idea of like the ancient past and the future at the same time. So I built this little like library of resources of objects from completely unknown artists. This is a little example of my files. And this was when I started really working with assistants. I guess prior to that time, I wouldn't even let my husband come into my studio. I was so nuts about it. I just had such a wall and a division between my studio world, and letting people in was really hard for me. And at that point, I started wanting to spread out and make all of these objects out of paint. And so I need to like bring other people into my studio to help me achieve that. And I started making all of these crazy things out of paint, like socks and rocks, and basically like everything that you have in daily life, I was trying to make paint forms out of it. And I was looking at a lot of Bernard, and basically like trying to go into Bernard and bring out what you felt or saw in that painting and make it into some kind of still life paint sculpture. This is like an example of one of those suggestions. It's a lemon made out of paint, and it never dried. So then during this line of investigation, when I was trying to figure out like how do I make a shoe out of paint, how do I make a rock out of paint, or whatever it might be, I was like, well, how do I make a tapestry out of paint? And at the time, I was using a lot of materials from the dollar store. Like I would just go to the dollar store and load up on things and take it back to my studio because that was pretty much all I could afford. And so I had these window screens on my floor, and I started pushing paint through it one night at like 10 o'clock at night. And then I was so excited because I was like, oh, I can make tapestries this way out of paint. So I ran back to the dollar store and I bought all of them that I could, and I started trying to create this process or formulate this process. So this was like one of the first little contraptions that I made. And I was thinking about like how I was essentially like deconstructing the idea of painting. Like I was taking apart the stretchers and I was mounting them on my wall, and I was taking off the canvas and just using the kind of like substrates that create a painting as the carriers of the screen, like they were just holding them up in front of the wall. And it's evolved since then. Like this is the one that's in my studio now, so that I can like work behind the screen and walk in front of it and revolve around it. And these were from the earlier times, but more advanced than the first one. So originally I was using just a template from a rug that I had at our apartment. And we had this cat named Poseidon, and he loved one of our rugs that we had, and so I wanted to like make a painting about this cat that I loved so much and the rug that he also adored. So I made this series of paintings called Poseidon rugs, and these were the first like tapestry paintings that I created. And at the time I was just painting them, with colors, like I was pushing the paint in like white paint in and then dyeing the paint and flipping them around manually. Like I didn't have them so far off the wall. I was just literally like with two people having to flip them around from the front and the back. And so this is like a close-up of one of those earlier works. And this is another example of what I was doing at the time. I was just making a series of these because I was truly just thinking that I was going to make paint rugs. It was kind of a weird moment. And this is a close-up. But I was excited about the potential of, like I said before, like this idea of Seurat or pointillism and how I could kind of pixelate the image in a way. From there, I just started looking more at tapestries and thinking about tapestries, especially pictorial tapestries. And I found that a lot of the ancient tapestries in existence were very similar to my drawings. So I realized that I could actually make one of these paintings from my drawings. So I guess like in 2016, 2 years after I started working this way, I began to like bring together this process with the drawings that I had always been doing on paper or on register tape. Oops, sorry. So this is one of the first ones actually that I made from a drawing. And there's the scale. So it was like my first time making these paintings from drawings and then putting them on a larger scale, so they actually became like these epic works. So now we are at this show. Fast forward a few more years. So I really thought a lot about the space on my own and with Aaron, and I felt like it was such a huge undertaking. I wanted to like be very strategic about how everything was placed in this exhibit. So the first room is essentially just works from the past couple of years, and I wanted each one of these pieces in the first room to sort of like act as a template for the rest of the show. So this painting, Night Garden, that you see as you enter the space is actually from an installation that I created in 2018 in Brooklyn at a space called Smackmelon. And I was invited to do this show right at the time that Trump was inaugurated. And they were going to have me put together this exhibition and open it a year after that time. And so after I was invited, I was thinking like, okay, where are we going to be in a year from now? Like, we're going to really need like a place of refuge. We're going to need a place to rest. And we're going to need a place to reflect. So I was thinking about these Egyptian gardens and how they would build walls around their gardens in order to protect themselves from the outer climates. And so I was thinking about how we would need like a walled off garden to like protect ourselves from the outer political climates. So this was the exhibition, and on the right side you can see the day garden, and then on the left side you see the night garden. So that's where that painting was coming from. It was just this entire installation. So I liked this idea that these paintings would be lit actually by the sun. And again, like, even though it's made in a different material and used for a different purpose, like all of these things come from drawings. So like these are the preliminary sketches for the windows. And then I made a series of benches. So this was my first time to make like a sculpture or some kind of like thing that could be used for people to sit on. When I first started designing the exhibition, I really wanted to create a swimming pool in the center of the room, but that got voted out. And I was kind of upset about it, but it did make sense. It wasn't exactly a rational idea. But I did want there to be like some kind of reflective surface in the space, like water is reflective, like if you had a water source inside of a garden. So I was looking at a lot of images of gardeners and noticing, like in a lot of the medieval tapestries or illuminated manuscripts, you would see a lot of male gardeners. So I began to put these like female gardeners pulling a flower out from the earth. So she would act as your support in the show, and you could sit on her and look either at the night sky or the day sky. And then this top, the bench top would reflect both the day and the night. Opposite that painting is this work called Swap Hunters. And there's two parts to this work. One being that when I started to like make this painting process and use my drawings as a resource, after that first strawberry sun painting, the one with all of the oranges, I decided to take a couple of years and just work with black, white, and gold. And I decided to like pare down my palette because I had still no idea what I was doing. And just trying to wrap my head around how to make these paintings was still like a full-time effort. Just how do I physically get it to stay? What materials do I use? How much medium do I mix? Like all of the kind of complications that came about in creating this process. And so while I was trying to sort all of that out, I decided to just stick to black, white, and gold. And so that went on for a couple of years. And I made a series of works about female hunters, and I wanted one of the paintings in the show to kind of speak back to that time when I was just using black, white, and gold. The other part of that painting was just the beginning of this series where I was thinking about when I lived in Savannah, Georgia. I stopped by a thrift store one time, and I was looking at this stack of books on the floor, and underneath it was this painting that had this really beautiful boat, and these African Americans like in the middle of the boat, like with these huge waves crashing all around them. And I just looked closer at the painting, and I noticed that someone had written inside the waves with a little paper clip, "We run things." And it was like a $5 painting, and I wish I had bought it. And I still think about that work, and this was many years later. I still wanted to pay tribute to that piece, but I used women in their place. So this painting is titled "We Run Things," and they're all doing these acts of labor or the work of men. And I was looking at a lot of like Egyptian pictograms of men pushing carts or sweeping the floor or doing these acts of labor, and I just made this machine of women working together doing these types of acts. So the other part of it was just looking at these hunters, and this whole series was called Gamekeepers. And it was just about thinking about hunters and the sort of like visual registry that we have from certain works of art, from these like everlasting themes of hunters or gardeners or fishers or whatever they might be. They're typically seen as male occupants of these roles. So I decided to take on this idea of a female hunter. And these were the kinds of paintings that I was looking at. Again, I'm still like in this world of artifact or just looking at things from people unknown. And this was the exhibition and originally where this painting was shown. And this painting is called Wrestling an Alligator, and there's a drawing of this work in the show as well. The piece Catch and Release is from a series of works that I made for a show in LA at Shulamit Nazarian called Catch and Release. That's what the title of the show was. And it was just about these women catching and releasing fish. And this painting sort of harkens back to the We Run Things work where these women are working together, kind of operating as a machine. And you'll see that sort of theme happening throughout the show here today, where these figures are fitting together and they're like gears within a machine. This was another painting from that show, and I was just essentially thinking about breadwinners and the idea of breadwinners and these women bringing home the goods from the field. So they're carrying these fish together, and this painting is called Heavy Lifting. So these women are doing all of the heavy lifting. And all of this happened right as Me Too movement was coming about. It was perfect timing. The other thing I would like to note is that these works were all the first step back into color. So as I said, I was working with black, white, and gold for many years, and this show in LA was my first step back into using a lot of vivid, bright colors. This is another couple of breadwinners that were made around that same time. This painting, Biting Nails, is also in the show today, and I wanted there to be some kind of symbolic point of reference in the show, because sometimes I'll take a very simple idea like feet or hands or the silhouette of a head or something like that, and then I'll sort of work in conjunction with whatever theme I'm involved in and try to bring up something sort of metaphorical or symbolic. So there are a couple of pieces in the show that are meant to sort of speak to this painting specifically, and I just like this idea of these nails, these female nails, which are typically places in which women groom themselves, and these fish grooming their nails for them. And I just thought that was a very simple and kind of poetic idea. And these were some of the images I was looking at as well, like the hands, obviously, and the feet kind of go back to all of our images from the beginning of time. They're used quite often to explain all sorts of worlds within and without the hands, because so much happens with our use of hands. It's a very universal symbol. And these were images from the show. So the second room of this exhibition, I was really thinking about women on land or landscape painting, and I definitely I'm not interested in literal landscape paintings, but even though it's a little bit hokey, I kind of like that the paint is pushed through a window screen, and so you're seeing a landscape through a window in a sense. And historically speaking, windows are thought of as or paintings are thought of as windows or portals into another world. So I wanted to speak indirectly to the idea of landscape in these work, and also just this idea of women in labor, women performing acts of labor. So each painting in this room sort of navigates between day and night, and all of the work in this room and the one after are new and were created for this exhibition. The first one is called Dead Tired, and I was thinking actually about a personal story when I was a kid. I remember seeing hills in the landscape and asking my mom what a hill was, and she told me that they were heels of giants under the ground. And so I sort of imagined that under the ground there are these giants throughout my childhood for way too long. And so even now sometimes I'll sort of look at a landscape as some type of figuration. So I wanted to talk about that story in this painting, and also just the idea that falling asleep with your shoes on is probably the most exhausted you could possibly be. You would never fall asleep with your shoes on unless you were absolutely exhausted. So this figure has fallen asleep with her shoes on because of her day of work. The other part of it is just that it's meant to be kind of like a landscape in the sense that the sun you see in the right-hand side, it's not really a sun, but the blanket is kind of suggesting these ideas of a landscape. And then this painting specifically uses a lot of earth tones and the the red patterns you see there, I was thinking about like gardens. And then of course, like on the soles of her shoes, they're green, just talk about grass. So to think of like that hill and those feet underneath that hill. And I was looking at a lot of Augustan paintings and thinking about how interesting it is that there's this whole lineage of paintings about people sleeping with their shoes on. And I thought that was kind of interesting to think about. These are works as they're made in the studio, and I think it's kind of fun to see them at the stage because they're really like suspended lines, and sometimes depending on whatever time of day it is, like you can just see these lines floating in space because the screen really disappears. And I think it's quite beautiful because the wall acts as like the background, and there are these floating lines rolling around the studio. And then just as another side note, it's really cool when the sun hits them because they create these shadows on the wall. And so there are these like many layers to making the paintings that are remarkable and quite entrancing for me as I'm creating them. Like I can see different realities happening as they're being made. The next work in this room is about beekeepers, and I started also making beekeepers right when Trump became our president, mostly because I was thinking about how we were just like in this new era of like danger, or we were just surrounded by this chaos, and we were trying to like walk through a new world of we didn't know where we were. We can't see in front of us too far, just like it might seem as you're walking through a swarm of bees. So I started looking at a lot of beekeeper images, and I decided to make a series of female beekeepers. And it was really interesting to sort of see the history of beekeeping and how it relates to art history, and this sort of like sacred nature that so many different cultures and histories have held the bee in such a high place in their history. So this was also made like during that black, white, and gold era, one of the early beekeepers. And this painting is called Two Watches, and there's a drawing also of this work in the show. And I was thinking about just the laborers in a beehive, and this woman's wearing two watches because she's trying to be in two places at one time because she's working so much. And so I just think that the whole society and the nature of bees in general is just such an interesting world to delve into. And again, like using these hands as sort of a symbol to speak to something that's universal. So these are the beekeepers in the show. And they're operating in the daytime. They're keeping their bees during the day, and they're involved in this dance. So I liked the idea of like these beekeepers dancing through their day, like having a good time while they worked. And I was looking at a lot of Degas paintings and impressionist works and Lautrec, and thinking about how like the graceful like movement of the body in relationship to the idea of like a working day was kind of an interesting contradiction and place to speak to. I was also looking at a lot of Matisse cutouts, and I wanted like for the viewer to be able to stand back from the beekeepers and just get this very hard-edged silhouette, a rendition of something that was very hard and like bulky, but also light and fluid, kind of like the same relationship that Matisse has to his cutouts. These were the beekeepers in the studio, and they look a lot bigger in there than they do in here. It was kind of shocking to see the scale relationship change as these works were brought into place. And this is me making all of the bees in the painting. The other aspect of this work is just that they were painted from the front and the back. So when you get up close to them, you can see the different blues, like there's a cobalt blue in the gloves, and then the lines on the drapery you can see are like this ultramarine color, and so all of those ultramarine lines were hand painted from the front. So it's kind of becoming an interesting moment where I'm working both the front and the back side of the painting, so I'm definitely like working all the way around the work. The next painting in the show is called Midnight Snack, and for this work I was thinking about the Courbet Stonebreakers, and how like that painting was such like a pivotal point in art history where you know, these laborers were made into heroes, and that was the first time in history that we saw that portrayed in a painting. And so I wanted to like speak back to that work, and you can see up in the trees this woman cracking open a peanut, and so it's meant to like sort of make that same sound or that same thought as those stonebreakers cracking a stone. There are many reasons why I like peanuts. I don't like to eat them, but I like the shapes of them. I think that they're fascinating shapes, and they're all the same elements, but they come in these wonderful forms. And the other part of this work is just that their shoes are made of peanuts, and so they're sort of like suspending gravity by being able to walk on them and not crushing them. So the idea of like a midnight snack is something that is a sacred moment, at least in my life, where if I wake up in the middle of the night and I have a midnight snack, I feel like somehow I'm revolting against some sort of conformity, or it's just like this true moment of escape from labor. So I wanted there to be a piece in the show that kind of was about escape. This piece called Watermelon Seeds, I picked this dress to sort of work with this painting, and I was thinking about this idea that I read in a New Age book, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it says that if you put a seed under your tongue and you hold it there for a few minutes and then you plant it into the ground, it will grow and develop whatever nutritional like values you need inside the plant or inside the vegetable. And again, I don't know if that's true, but I liked the idea of just like this woman and nature becoming one, or the idea of like humans and nature becoming one force together. For this painting, I was looking at a lot of Keith Haring works, and actually, like, I've really gotten into Keith Haring lately. I'm a little bit obsessed, especially with these obscure drawings that no one seems to know about, and they're just really visceral and strange and much more interesting to me than a lot of works that we know of Keith Haring. This one's called Cruella de Vil. So just like a very crude drawing with these patterns and expressions that somehow say something so beyond a cartoon. The last room in the show, I was thinking about works, these women and works relating to water. And so each one kind of revolves around an idea about water. Most recently, I've been making these paintings about scrubbing turtles for a few reasons. One is that I find turtles to be this symbol for me of like elements of hard and soft coming together. So I think for me, one of my biggest challenges is knowing when to be hard and knowing when to be soft about something, especially in work. Like, I find myself constantly negotiating between knowing when to be, you know, hard-edged and firm, and then knowing when to be soft and kind. They're not naturally, like, always working together, so I wanted to make paintings about what it's like to maintain that kind of negotiation at all times. So this work is called Dirty Turtles, and I was thinking about like everything in the show is meant to be like sort of a landscape painting, and I wanted there to be like an internal landscape or a domestic space conveyed. So these turtles are stacked on top of each other, much like a big stack of dirty dishes. And that's actually what I was thinking about, was like the relationship between what it's like to scrub your dishes every day and have this whole heap of dishes to clean, and also like scrubbing these turtles every day, and relate the two of those ideas together. These paintings are called Walking on Water, and I was looking at a lot of, again, like these medieval paintings, and how like a lot of the water was made by these various lines, and I thought it was interesting to like try and relate to a body of water through just the simplicity of line work. So I was studying a lot of etchings and how like cross-hatching and etching lines come together, and I actually read an interesting quote by Richard Tuttle. He collects a lot of etchings, and he said that like the reason he collects them is because he finds that the points of infinity are found within the lines of etchings, and I felt like that was a really beautiful idea, and so I wanted to like speak to that world of etching, or to create water out of lines. These paintings are called Shallow Water 1 and Shallow Water 2, and they really like are talking back to that catch and release painting where these women are working together as a machine, and each of them are individually like different gears working together. And I was looking at a lot of Max Beckmann etchings that I found throughout this etching investigation, and also Matisse. It's the other one. And then the last painting in the show is called Reflection. I wanted in this work to convey the ideas of day and night coming together. So the circles and the eyeballs on top of these mounds are meant to be like the sun, and then the background is black, as if it's night. And then the mounds of water are meant to sort of be like hills, and also like water. So it's just this kind of contradiction happening. And then the fish coming out of the eyes is going back to this painting that I made also in the Catch and Release show, and it's called Fish Tears. And I was thinking about the symbol of fish, and how it's like used in all these different religions and histories, and how it has all this weight attached to it depending on where you find it in these different stories. And I wanted to combine it with the tear, and how like the tear is this weightless little speck of water, but it has this psychological weight behind it. So this painting is sort of like touching back to that fish tear work, where the fish are sort of flying out of the eyes on top of these mounds, and they're floating in the sky and then going back into the water. So it's just this eternal kind of hurricane of fish going in and out of water and air. And then to end, I wrote this, blood, sweat, and tears are literally things we shed from our bodies. We cut ourselves and we bleed. We cry tears that fall from our eyes. With heat and hard work, we sweat out bodily fluid. Through the literal shedding of blood, sweat, and tears, we find a new way of thinking, a new way of feeling. This physical release allows me to free myself from within. It is the freedom to express myself, the freedom to think freely.